The weight of command. The fortress of Greyholm stood like a scar against the northern mountains, its obsidian walls carved from the same stone that had witnessed empires rise and crumble into forgotten dust. Commander Aldrich Thorne had walked these halls for 20 years, his boots echoing on floors polished by generations of soldiers who believed that order could be maintained through strength alone. He was the Emperor's left hand, the man who made difficult decisions before breakfast and signed execution orders before lunch. His reputation preceded him like winter wind, cold and unforgiving, and he wore it the way other men wore medals. But tonight, as he stood on the highest tower watching the last transport ships disappear into the violet dusk, he felt the weight of something heavier than duty pressing against his ribs. Tomorrow would mark the arrival of Pyrax, the crimson drake whose very name made seasoned warriors check their weapons twice. The creature had raised 3 rebellious colonies in the span of a month, each strike so precise that survivors spoke of it as divine judgment rather than military action. The Emperor had personally assigned the beast to Aldrich's command, a promotion that tasted like ash in his mouth. He had seen dragons before, of course. Every military compound kept a few of the smaller breeds, their wings clipped by binding spells, their fire reduced to controlled bursts used for welding metal and intimidating prisoners. But Pyrax was different. The drake belonged to the ancient bloodline, the kind that scholars wrote about in texts so old the pages crumbled at human touch. It could think, they said. It could remember grudges that outlived kingdoms, and it had never bowed to anyone, not really. The control collar around its throat simply left it no choice but to obey. Aldrich descended the tower, stairs with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned long ago that hesitation was another word for weakness. His quarters were sparse, decorated only with maps and duty rosters, the furniture chosen for function rather than comfort. He poured himself a measure of blackberry wine, a luxury he allowed himself once per season, and sat at his desk where a single letter lay waiting. It was from his sister, Helena, who lived in the capital with her daughter. The handwriting was rushed, the word simple. Mira asks about you. She wants to know if heroes ever get tired. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where he kept things that mattered, but had no place in a fortress. Mira was 8 now, an age where the world still seemed like a story waiting to be told. She had his sister's dark eyes and a curiosity that reminded him of who he used to be, before the uniform became his skin. He had not seen her in 2 years. There was always another crisis, another deployment, another reason to postpone the visit that might remind him he was still human beneath the armor. The alarm bells shattered his thoughts with their metallic shrieking. Aldrich was moving before his mind fully processed the sound, his hand finding his sword belt as he strode into the corridor where soldiers were already assembling with the swift efficiency of constant training. Captain Veron met him at the command center, her face pale beneath her helmet. "Sir, it's the Drake transport. They're requesting emergency landing. Something's wrong with the containment field." Aldrich felt his jaw tighten. "How wrong?" "The pilot says Pyrax is awake and restless. The collar's holding, but barely. They're coming in fast." He reached the landing platform as the transport broke through the cloud cover, its engines screaming with the strain of carrying cargo that had decided it no longer wished to be cargo. The ship lurched sideways, corrected, then dropped the final 100 feet with a grace that belonged more to falling than flying. The landing struts groaned as they absorbed the impact, and for a heartbeat, everything held. Then the rear hatch exploded outward in a shower of molten metal and ancient fury. Pyrax emerged like a sunset given teeth and rage. Scales the color of fresh blood caught the fortress lights and turned them into warnings. The drake's wings, even partially folded, cast shadows large enough to swallow buildings, but it was the eyes that stopped Aldrich's breath in his throat. They burned with an intelligence that made mockery of every chain and collar humanity had ever forged. This was not an animal. This was something that had chosen to let itself be captured, because the alternative was watching the world burn, and even rage gets tired eventually. The control collar hummed with desperate energy, its runes flaring bright enough to leave after images. Pyrax's head snapped to the side as if pulled by invisible strings, and a sound emerged from deep within the drake's chest that Aldrich felt in his bones before he heard it with his ears. Not a roar. A scream, raw and terrible. The sound of something magnificent being reduced to a tool. "Weapons ready," Veron ordered, and 24 crossbows loaded with suppression bolts tilted toward the sky. Aldrich raised his hand. a gesture that surprised him as much as it surprised his soldiers. "Hold. Sir, protocol requires." I said hold. His voice carried the weight of 20 years of unquestioned authority, and the weapons lowered, though reluctantly. He stepped forward alone, moving with deliberate slowness across the scorched landing pad. Behind him he could hear Veron's sharp intake of breath, the muttered prayers of men who had just watched their commander choose potential suicide over certain procedure. Pyrax's gaze locked onto him, and Aldrich felt the full measure of that attention, like standing before a judge who could see through flesh and bone into the trembling truth beneath. The Drake's nostrils flared, tasting the air, reading him in ways that had nothing to do with sight. For a long moment, they simply stood there, predator and prey, except Aldrich could not shake the feeling that the labels had become confused. "I know," he said quietly, words meant for ears that might not understand language but surely understood tone. "I know what they've done to you. I know what they'll make me do with you." The collar pulsed, demanding obedience, demanding the Drake bow its head and accept the yoke. Pyrax's legs trembled with the effort of resistance, muscles like coiled steel fighting against magic that had been perfected over centuries of subjugation. Blood, dark as wine, trickled from where the collar's edge bit into scaled flesh. And then, from the shadows near the barracks, a voice called out with the clear, unafraid curiosity of someone too young to have learned proper fear. "Why is it crying?" Aldrich turned to see a child standing in the doorway, a girl with tangled dark hair and eyes that reflected the fortress lights like scattered stars. She wore a traveling cloak too large for her frame and carried a worn stuffed bear under one arm. Helena's daughter, Mira, his niece who should have been safely in the capital, who should never have been anywhere near this place of controlled violence and necessary cruelty. "Mira, get back inside." His command came out harsher than intended, sharpened by sudden fear, but the girl didn't move. She was staring at Pyrax with an expression Aldrich recognized because he had seen it in mirrors when he was young, before the world taught him that wonder was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to be vulnerable. She took a step forward, then another, moving with the unhurried confidence of children who have not yet learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. "Mira, stop." Helena's voice joined his, frantic and desperate. But the girl was already crossing the distance between herself and the dragon, her small feet making no sound on the cooling metal. Pyrax's head lowered, following her approach with the intensity of a storm deciding where to strike. The collar flared brighter, trying to override whatever calculation was occurring behind those burning eyes. Aldrich's hand moved to his sword, knowing it would be useless, knowing he would draw it anyway if the Drake made one. Aggressive motion toward his niece, but Mira simply walked up to the massive creature and placed her small hand against the scales just below where the collar cut into flesh. Her palm barely covered a single scale, a laughably inadequate gesture that somehow carried the weight of every kindness the world had failed to offer. "You don't like that thing around your neck," she said. Not a question, but a simple observation delivered with the matter-of-fact tone children use when stating obvious truths that adults have learned to ignore. "It hurts you." "I'm sorry." "That's not fair." The fortress held its breath. Soldiers forgot their training. Even the wind seemed to pause mid-gust, waiting to see what would happen when innocence met power at the intersection of impossible moments. Pyrax's eyes closed, and when they opened again, something had shifted behind them. The rage was still there, the ancient fury of chains and cages, but beneath it now lived something else. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the exhausted relief of being seen as more than a weapon for the first time in longer than human memory could measure. The Drake's breath came out in a long, controlled exhale that smelled of sulfur and distant wildfires, and very gently, with a precision that would have impressed the finest watchmaker. Pyrax lowered its massive head until the girl could reach the space between its eyes where no collar could bite, no magic could compel. Aldrich felt something crack open in his chest, some calcified piece of himself he had thought dead so long ago. He watched his niece stroke the Drake's scales with the same gentle attention she gave to injured birds and lost cats, murmuring words too soft for him to hear but clear enough in intention that translation became unnecessary. Captain Veron appeared at his elbow, her voice carefully controlled. "Sir, your orders?" He looked at the weapons still trained on the dragon, at the soldiers waiting for permission to do what they had been trained to do, at the massive beast that could end them all with a single breath, but had chosen instead to accept comfort from a child who offered nothing but honest compassion. "Stand down," Aldrich said, his voice rough with emotions he had no names for. All weapons down. Now. The crossbows lowered with obvious reluctance. Somewhere in the command center, someone would be drafting a report that would reach the Emperor by morning, full of words like containment breach and protocol violation and immediate disciplinary review. Aldrich found he didn't care. For the first time in 20 years, the weight pressing against his ribs had shifted, and he could breathe. Mira looked back at him over her shoulder, her face lit with simple joy. Uncle Aldrich, he has a name. A real one, not the one they gave him, he told me. Well, not with words, but I heard it anyway. Do you want to know? He crossed the distance between them, his shadow falling across both child and dragon, and knelt in the scorched residue of Pyrax's arrival. Up close, he could see the scars beneath the scales, the places where bindings had worn flesh raw over decades of servitude. Yes, he said, and meant it with every part of himself that remembered how to be human. Tell me his name. The sun rose over Greyholm Fortress with the apologetic warmth of early spring, touching stone that had known too many winters. In the western courtyard, a circle had formed, not of soldiers but of something stranger. Captain Varen stood with her arms crossed, watching a small girl teach the Empire's most feared weapon how to play a game involving 3 pebbles and a surprising amount of patience. Pyrax, the crimson drake whose name had been whispered in frightened prayers across a dozen worlds, sat with the careful stillness of someone learning an entirely new language. Aldrich watched from the command tower, a cup of cold tea forgotten in his hand. He had not slept. The report sat unsigned on his desk, each one a careful documentation of protocol violations that would normally end a military career with efficient brutality. But every time he picked up his pen, he remembered Mira's hand on the drake's scales, remembered the way ancient eyes had softened at a child's simple declaration that pain was unfair. Helena found him there as morning drill began in the eastern yard, her travel cloak still dusty from the road. His sister had always moved with purpose, even when the purpose was to deliver inconvenient truths to brothers who had spent decades avoiding them. You look terrible, she said by way of greeting, taking the cold tea from his hand and setting it aside with the firm gentleness of someone who had raised a child alone while her brother played soldier in distant fortresses. I've had better nights. He gestured toward the courtyard below where Mira was now explaining. Some complex rule involving which pebble counted as the moon. She shouldn't be here. This is no place for children. Neither is the capital right now. Helena's voice carried an edge he'd rarely heard from her. The Emperor's advisors are pushing for another expansion campaign. They're calling up reserves, drafting boys barely old enough to shave. I couldn't keep her there, not with what's coming. At least here she has her uncle. The words landed with more weight than she probably intended. Uncle. A title he wore poorly, made of brief visits and gifts sent by courier and promises to attend birthday celebrations he never quite managed to keep. Yet Mira had recognized him instantly last night, had run to him with the uncomplicated faith of someone who believed that family meant something more permanent than duty rosters and military deployments. Below, Pyrax made a sound that might have been curiosity, or might have been the beginning of a laugh. The drake's tail curled around Mira protectively as she bent to retrieve a pebble that had rolled too far, and Aldrich felt his throat tighten at the casual intimacy of the gesture. The collar, he said quietly, it's still active. The control matrix is still functional, but he's not responding the way he should. Helena moved to stand beside him, their shoulders nearly touching in the way they used to stand when they were children watching storms roll in over their father's farm. Maybe, she said, he was never supposed to respond that way at all. Maybe none of them were. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to be extinguished. Aldrich thought of the smaller drakes in the compound, their wings clipped, their fire reduced to useful tools. He thought of the binding ceremonies he had witnessed, the rituals that turned wild intelligence into obedient weapons. He had never questioned it before because questioning the foundation upon which you stood seemed like an excellent way to discover you were standing on nothing at all. The Emperor will hear about this, he said. Not quite a question. The Emperor already has heard about it. The entire capital is talking about nothing else. A child calming the crimson drake with nothing but kindness. They're calling it a miracle. Some are calling it treason. Helena's expression softened, What are you going to do, Aldrich? Before he could answer, a commotion erupted at the fortress gates. A delegation had arrived, their banners bearing the Emperor's personal seal. 3 carriages accompanied by enough armed guards to suggest this was not a casual visit. Aldrich recognized the lead horseman immediately. Commander Thrace, the Emperor's right hand, a man who made Aldrich's reputation for ruthlessness look like amateur theater. "We have visitors," he said, the professional mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Helena, take Mira to my quarters. Don't let her leave until I come for you. Aldrich, please." The word came out rougher than intended. "Whatever happens, keep her safe." Helena studied his face for a long moment, seeing past the commander to the younger brother, who used to sneak her extra bread when their father's crops failed. She nodded once and left without further argument. Her footsteps quick on the tower stairs. Aldrich descended to meet Thrace in the main hall, a space designed to intimidate visiting dignitaries with its vaulted ceilings and walls, covered in captured banners from defeated enemies. Thrace stood examining a particularly tattered flag from the Sorrow Coast Rebellion, his expression suggesting he found the decor quaint. "Commander Thorne." Thrace's voice carried the cold precision of a man who measured words the way accountants measured coins. "I trust you received the Emperor's summons." "I received no summons. An oversight on my part. Allow me to correct it now. The Emperor requires your immediate presence in the capital, along with the Drake Pyrax and rather specifically the child who performed yesterday's touching display of interspecies diplomacy." Aldrich kept his expression neutral. "Mira is my niece. She's a civilian, barely 8 years old. She has no place in imperial politics. The Emperor disagrees. As do I." Thrace moved away from the banners, his boots clicking on marble floors. "A child who can calm our most dangerous asset with a touch is either the greatest security risk we've ever seen, or the greatest opportunity. We intend to determine which. She's not an asset to be evaluated. She's a little girl. And Pyrax is not a pet to be coddled by sentimental handlers, yet here we are." Thrace's smile had all the warmth of winter steel. "You have 2 hours to prepare for departure. Pack light." The Emperor's patience, as always, is somewhat limited. He left with his guards, the sound of their synchronized footsteps fading down the corridor like a countdown. Aldrich stood in the empty hall, feeling the walls he had built around himself over 20 years of service beginning to crack in ways that could not be repaired. Captain Veron found him there, her expression troubled. "Sir, the delegation is also asking about the collar. They want it reinforced before transport. They're bringing in a specialist. Might tell them no." "Sir, tell them the collar remains as is. Any modifications must be approved by me personally." Veron's eyes widened slightly, the only outward sign of her surprise. In 20 years of service together, Aldrich had never countermanded an imperial order. He had built his reputation on obedience, on being the man who did what needed doing without complaint or hesitation. "Are you certain, sir? This could be considered." "I'm certain, Captain. Dismissed." She left, though not without a backward glance that suggested she understood more than he wanted her to. Aldrich made his way to the western courtyard where Mira still sat with Pyrax, now apparently teaching the Drake about cloud shapes and why the one overhead looked exactly like a sailing ship if you squinted properly. The Drake noticed him first, those burning eyes tracking his approach with an awareness that felt distinctly like being measured and found wanting. But there was something else there now, a quality Aldrich couldn't quite name. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the recognition that trust might be possible if given enough time and honesty. "Uncle Aldrich." Mira jumped up, her face bright with uncomplicated happiness. "Did you know that Emberian used to live in mountains so high that snow never melted?" "He showed me. Not with words, but I could see it anyway. There were caves full of crystals that sang when the wind blew through them." Emberian, his real name. The one he had before they gave him that other one. She said it as if this should have been obvious, as if names were things you could simply know if you bothered to listen properly. Aldrich crouched down to her level, aware of Pyrax, no, Emberian, watching every gesture. "Mira, some people are coming to take us to the capital. To the Emperor's palace." Her eyes went wide. "Really? Will there be gardens?" "Mama said the palace has gardens with flowers from other worlds." "Yes, but—" He paused, choosing his words with more care than he'd given any military briefing. "They want to see you because of what you did last night. Because you helped Emberian when he was hurting. That was very brave, but some people might not understand. They might ask you questions that feel strange or scary." Mira's expression grew serious. a shadow of adult understanding crossing features still soft with childhood. Are they going to hurt him again? The question landed like a blow. Aldrich found himself looking at Emberian, at the collar still humming around the drake's throat, at the scars visible beneath crimson scales. How many times had he given orders that resulted in similar pain? How many creatures had he reduced to weapons without once asking if they minded the transformation? Not if I can help it, he said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised him. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She nodded solemnly, then turned to Emberian and placed both small hands against the drake's snout. We're going on a trip, but Uncle Aldrich won't let anyone hurt you. He promised. The drake made a sound like distant thunder softened by morning mist and very carefully touched his nose to the top of Mira's head. It was a gesture of such gentle deliberation that Aldrich felt something in his chest crack further. Some protective shell he'd built to survive 2 decades of necessary cruelty, finally giving way to something dangerously close to hope. The Emperor's question, the imperial palace, sprawled across the heart of the capital like a promise made in marble and ambition. Its towers caught the afternoon sun and scattered it across gardens where flowers from conquered worlds bloomed in careful arrangements, their colors chosen to spell out dynastic mottos in a language only the very educated could read. Aldrich stood in an antechamber decorated with tapestries depicting glorious military victories, including 3 he'd personally commanded, and wondered when glory had started feeling so much like mourning. Mira pressed herself against his side, her earlier enthusiasm dampened by the palace's cold grandeur. Helena had stayed behind at their assigned quarters, ostensibly to rest from the journey, but really they both knew, because the Emperor had requested Mira's presence specifically, and one did not bring unauthorized family members to imperial audiences. It's very quiet, Mira whispered, her voice small in the vast space. Don't they have any children here? Before Aldrich could answer, the ceremonial doors opened with the theatrical precision the palace was famous for. A herald in cloth of gold gestured them forward into the throne room, a space designed to make visitors feel appropriately insignificant. The ceiling rose 3 stories overhead, painted with scenes of imperial expansion. The floor was polished stone that reflected like still water, and at the far end, seated on a throne of obsidian and silver, waited Emperor Caius III, ruler of 17 worlds and keeper of secrets that predated most of the stars visible from his palace windows. He was smaller than Aldrich remembered, or perhaps command had simply made him seem larger during their previous meetings. The Emperor's hair had gone completely white since Aldrich last saw him 2 years ago, and new lines mapped his face like rivers carving canyons through stone. But his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing, measuring everything. Commander Thorne, you may approach. Aldrich walked forward with military precision, aware of guards positioned at every pillar, of advisors clustered like storm clouds along the room's edges. He stopped at the prescribed distance and saluted with the efficiency of long practice. Mira, bless her, mimicked the gesture with such earnest concentration that several advisors' expressions softened slightly. Your Majesty, we have heard remarkable things about your niece. The Emperor's gaze fixed on Mira with the intensity of someone examining a puzzle piece that didn't fit any known pattern. Tell me, child, when you touched the drake called Pyrax, what did you feel? Mira looked up at Aldrich, seeking permission. He nodded once, then watched as his 8-year-old niece faced down the most powerful human in known space with the kind of honesty that made advisors shift uncomfortably. I felt sad for him, she said simply. The collar was hurting his neck and his heart felt like it was crying. He wanted to go home, but he couldn't remember where home was anymore. That made him angry, but under the angry was just lonely. Really, really lonely. The throne room went so quiet that Aldrich could hear his own heartbeat, each thud marking the passing of moments that felt balanced on the edge of something irreversible. And how? The Emperor said carefully. Did you know what he was feeling? Did he speak to you? Not with words. But you don't need words to know when someone hurts. You just have to pay attention. Mama says lots of people forget to pay attention because they're too busy thinking about other things. An advisor near the throne, an elderly man whose name Aldrich couldn't remember, leaned forward to whisper something urgent in the Emperor's ear. The ruler raised one hand, a gesture that commanded silence as effectively as shouting. Your mother sounds wise. Tell me, if I remove the drake's collar, what do you think would happen? The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of shocked whispers through the assembled court. Aldrich felt his hand move instinctively toward his sword, though who he thought to protect with such a gesture he couldn't say. Mira tilted her head, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think he'd fly away very fast, but not to hurt people, to find mountains where crystals sing. And maybe after a while, when he stopped being so scared and angry, he'd come back sometimes to visit, because that's what friends do. You consider yourself his friend? I'd like to be, if he'd let me. The Emperor studied her for a long moment, then shifted his attention to Aldrich. Commander Thorne, in your military assessment, would removing the control collar from Pyrax result in immediate hostile action? It was a trap, obviously. Answer yes, and he condemned Emberian to continued bondage. Answer no, and he challenged centuries of imperial doctrine regarding Drake management. Every instinct honed through 20 years of surviving palace politics screamed at him to deflect, to request time for proper evaluation, to hide behind protocol and procedure. Instead, he heard himself say, I believe, Your Majesty, that if treated with basic dignity, the Drake called Pyrax might prove more loyal than any collar could compel. The whispers erupted into actual voices now. Advisors arguing in urgent undertones. Someone demanded immediate disciplinary action. Someone else called for a formal military tribunal. Through it all, the Emperor sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Finally, he raised his hand again, and silence returned like a trained dog. Bring the Drake here. I would meet this creature, who has inspired such unusual loyalty in both child and commander. The palace guards moved with practiced efficiency, though Aldrich noted the slight tremor in one young soldier's hand as he departed to relay the order. They waited in that crystalline silence, Mira's small hand finding his, squeezing once in a gesture of comfort that he desperately needed but would never ask for. When Emberian entered, he had to bend his neck to fit through doors designed to accommodate human dignity, but not draconic reality. His scales caught the afternoon light streaming through high windows and transformed it into something that belonged in temples rather than throne rooms. The control collar pulsed its steady rhythm of subjugation, but the Drake moved with a careful dignity that made the magic seem small and petty by comparison. He saw Mira immediately, and that massive head lowered in greeting that was both gentle and unmistakable in its meaning. The assembled court stepped back as one, centuries of instinct overriding weeks of careful planning. But Mira simply walked forward, her small figure dwarfed by the Drake's presence, and placed her hand against his snout, in that gesture that had somehow become their language. Emberian, this is the Emperor. He wants to ask you something important. The Drake's gaze shifted to the throne, and Aldrich watched carefully as Emperor Caius met those burning eyes without flinching. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, the Emperor rose from his throne and descended the steps to stand on the same level as everyone else in the room. I inherited an empire, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space, built on the principle that power justifies itself. That strength properly applied creates order. That beings of intelligence can be bound and made useful through superior magic and military force. He paused, letting the words settle. My grandfather conquered 7 worlds using dragons controlled through collar magic. My father added 6 more using the same methods. I have added 4, and planned for 3 more. He walked closer to Emberian, close enough that one angry exhalation could have ended the dynasty. But today a child taught me that perhaps we have confused control with loyalty, obedience with alliance. That what we call victory might simply be very efficient tyranny. The Emperor reached up, and for one impossible moment, Aldrich thought the ruler of 17 worlds was going to touch the Drake the way Mira had. Instead, his hand moved to the clasp at his own throat, removing the ceremonial chain of office that had been worn by every emperor for 8 generations. He held it out, letting light catch the jewels embedded in ancient platinum. This chain, he said quietly, is a symbol of power. It marks me as different from my subjects elevated by birth and destiny. But it is still a chain. Just as that collar is a chain, and I find myself wondering what would happen if we stopped defining ourselves by our chains and started defining ourselves by what we choose when given the freedom to choose. He turned to Aldrich. Commander Thorne, you are hereby ordered to remove the control collar from this Drake. Not as punishment, not as experiment, but as acknowledgement that we have perhaps been asking the wrong questions for far too long. The throne room erupted. Advisors shouted contradictions. Guards looked to their commanders for guidance that didn't come. Through the chaos, Aldrich heard only his own breathing and Mira's small voice saying, "See? I told you he'd understand." He stepped forward, his hands suddenly steady with purpose rather than duty. "I'll need tools. The collar's magic is woven into the physical structure. It can't simply be unlocked." "Then we'll cut it off," the Emperor said. "I believe my engineers can manage that." It took 3 hours. They worked in the palace forge, a space that usually produced ceremonial swords and decorative armor for courtly occasions. Engineers approached with the nervous care of men diffusing explosives, which essentially they were. The collar had been designed to kill its wearer if tampered with. A final insurance against rebellion. Mira sat nearby, talking to Emberian in her stream of consciousness way, telling him about cloud shapes and crystal caves and a story her mother once told her about a knight who learned that his armor was actually a cage. The Drake listened with the focused attention of someone hearing truths they'd forgotten they knew. When the final binding snapped and the collar fell away in pieces of defeated magic, Emberian's roar shook dust from rafters and sent several engineers diving for cover. But it wasn't rage. It was relief so profound it had to be shouted. Grief so old it needed noise to begin the long process of healing. Then, in the silence that followed, the Drake lowered his head and placed it gently in front of the Emperor's boots. Not submission, acknowledgement, the kind of respect given freely rather than extracted through force. "Well then," Emperor Caius said, his voice rough with emotions his advisors had probably never heard from him. "I suppose we have a great deal of work to do, starting with discovering how many other beings we've been treating as weapons when they might have preferred to be partners." Mira clapped her hands once, the sound absurdly loud in the stunned silence. "Does this mean Emberian can stay with us?" "I promised to show him the gardens." The Emperor looked at Aldrich, one eyebrow raised in question. "Commander, I believe this is now your department. I'm creating a new position, Ambassador of Cooperative Relations. Someone needs to figure out how we rebuild an empire on mutual respect, rather than enforced loyalty. Are you interested?" Aldrich felt Helena's words from days ago echo in his mind. "What are you going to do?" He looked at Mira, at Emberian, at the pieces of broken collar scattered on the forge floor. He thought about 20 years of duty that had slowly carved away everything he'd once believed about honor and justice. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said. "I'm interested." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, his reflection in Emberian's eyes showed him someone he might actually want to become. Outside the palace, in gardens where flowers from conquered worlds were learning to grow together without anyone forcing them into prescribed patterns, a small girl laughed as a crimson drake created tiny whirlwinds to lift fallen petals into spiraling dances. Her uncle watched from a nearby bench, his military uniform replaced with civilian clothes that felt strange and wonderful, like wearing possibility instead of duty. Above them, the sky stretched infinite and welcoming, full of directions no one had yet told them they couldn't explore. And in the throne room, an emperor sat at a desk rather than on a throne, signing orders that would reshape 17 worlds. Each signature came easier than the last, as if the weight of chains, even golden ones, had been slowly crushing him without his noticing until a child showed him what freedom looked like. History would call it revolution. They would call it courage. But really, it was just the simple decision to listen when someone said that pain was unfair, and then to believe that maybe, just maybe, kindness could be strong enough to build something better than conquest. The rest, as they say, was merely the work of making that belief real. And work, unlike chains, is something you choose to carry.